This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, I think it's time to start. Welcome everyone for our penultimate session, in which we will be discussing the chapter on the inconstructible question, which is a long chapter, but not as long as the previous one. And a very central chapter in the book, I think, because the musical chapter was also very important. But here we get some key ideas of what Bloch now calls in this chapter the utopian philosophy. We get that very clearly, but in a lot of detail spelled out. And as I was trying to think about how to summarize this chapter or how to place it, I came up with that thing over there. Let me just briefly explain that, because it just is a kind of an overview of how I see this fitting into the rest, and then we can go into a more detailed discussion of some of the sections. We cannot not hope to cover all of it, but hopefully we can look at some of the more important things. So as you remember, the book is constructed. The book is constructed around two major parts, at least in the 1923 edition. One is called the Selbstbegegnung, the self-encounter, and then the other one is Karl Marx, Der Tod und die Apokalypse, Marx, Death and Apocalypse. And the chapter on Selbstbegegnung, the part on Selbstbegegnung, looked at so it had the opening chapter on the outer Krug, and then it looked at ornament and music, and now being constructed a question. So these are obviously three moments in this notion of self-encounter, which is so essential. And what I've summarized this by saying that the motive, so we always get in most of Bloch's texts, we get a motive, either in the form of a motto or in the form of a short statement or an aphorism of some sort. I think we can take ein alter Krug to be the motto, as it were, for the whole section of self-encounter. So the Krug really articulates in an exemplary way the movement of dialectic, the relation between inner and outer, between subject and object. And then in ornament, we looked at we looked at art in the first two chapters. In the section of ornament, we looked at, I think, at the notion of exodus, the notion of things being more than what they are, and how this represents itself in artistic activity. And that came to a head in the long chapter on music, in which of all the arts, music is presented as what he calls at the end a kind of hellhören, clairaudience, in which the utopian, or the pre-appearance of utopia is most palpably present. So that bit of that section on part of Selbstbegegnung, I think, deals with art. And then in the chapter that now follows, the inconstructible question, the shape of the inconstructible question, I think we're talking about individual existence, about subjectivity, or about the use of several words, die Seele, wir, ich, selbst, also as Existenz, seeking Existenz verstehen, I. So he uses several words, but they all seem to point to what we might call an analytic of Dasein, of being there. And it's almost a prequel to being in time, if you want to read it like that. And again, we have a motive, which is von selbst, which at the beginning almost literally indicates the topic of the chapter. And then we get a number of sections, which when you read them at first might seem to be only very loosely related, or unclear how they are related, but I do think they make a lot of sense. There is a section, vom Gediegenen in uns, which deals, I'll say a little bit more about it in a minute, which deals, I think, with this idea of what Bloch later calls das Ultimum, the ultimate. So that which, in last instance, provides orientation for action or for interpretation and understanding. Then in the section on Alexanderzug, which is a very strange chapter, the Alexanderzug, he prepares in a way, well there's a lot going on in that chapter, but in a way he prepares the move to a discussion of Marx later on, because and there was also a reference to the Russian Revolution in the beginning of the book, of course, because this is about the motive, the religious motive, the geographical motive, and the speculative motive, that the light comes from the east, ex oriente lux, which is of course a religious formulation, but he translates it into a geopolitical formulation in reference to Lenin, to the Russian Revolution, but also in a more speculative sense. There is this notion of the morning land and the evening land, which has been important for Nietzsche, it was important for Spengler, but it's also important for Bloch as an orientation. And so that is where geography and utopia meet. And that is an interesting area that Bloch explores later, especially in the literary essays. There is a whole section on Geographica, as he calls it, and also in Das Prinzip Hoffnung, of course, there's a long discussion of the notion of the geographical, the notion of place, the notion of utopian as something that materializes in a place. And we've seen, we talked about the relation between history and, so between Exodus and Reich, Exodus and kingdom, before kingdom also being a notion of spatial extension. So that happens in Alexanderzug. Then you get Kant and Hegel, which is actually a section taken from, I'm talking about the 1923 version now, taken from the 1918 version, from that chapter that we are not discussing today, but which we should have been discussing really, on die Gedankenatmosphäre dieser Zeit. So the intellectual atmosphere of our times, which is not in the 1923 edition, it's quite a long, lengthy chapter in the 1918 version, in which contemporary philosophers are discussed, Husserl, Nietzsche, Hartmann, neo-Kantians, the psychologists, etc., but also the section on Kant and Hegel. And he left out the rest, but he took that section and put it in the chapter on the constructible question, which is also the 1918 version, but much shorter. So we'll talk about that. That introduces, right at the end, two main metaphors, if you can call it that, of speaking in tongues and divination. Zungenreden and Weissagen. And they, of course, bear some relation to the Hellhörer, the clairaudience that we talked about when we discussed the chapter on music. So Kant is the one who speaks in tongues, and Hegel is the prophet or the divinator. So we have to think about what that means. I think that chapter is very important. It shows Bloch's interesting original inheritance of the neo-Kantian motives that he had been, that he grew up with, that were taught to him in school and in university. But he takes it in a completely different direction. He ontologizes, if you want to put it like that, the regulative idea. I think he does that by drawing on the notion of the degrees of being, a very classical Platonic, Neoplatonic conception, and reads Kant through the lens of the doctrine of the degrees of being, and can do that because he has got Hegel in Rücken, so to say. He already has read Hegel, and that's why he can go back to Kant and get that out. But the form's almost like, yeah, it's almost a trick or a feat to put Kant and Hegel in a constellation in which they both become irreducible to each other, but also require each other. And I think it's maybe not going too far to say that constellation between Kant and Hegel is in a way definitive of a lot of the theoretical constructions that we find in, let's say, critical theory, Frankfurt School. Adorno, when we read Adorno, it became quite clear what dialectic is a constant toing and froing between Kant and Hegel. You can't stand when I'm teaching that this... excuse me, we're teaching here, could you please be quiet? Sorry, I can't stand that sort of... I'm sorry, calm down, I'm counting to 10. Yeah, so when we read language dialectic last year, we saw very clearly that there is this constant toing and froing between Kant and Hegel, Kantian and Hegelian positions. And it all has to do, for Adorno at least, with the idea of the utopian as that which always breaks over the situation. The material is always that which cannot be reduced to any sort of categorical scheme, and is therefore always the Kantian moment in a dialectical philosophy. And I think that idea emerges here. I wouldn't be surprised if for Adorno and for Benjamin and for some of the others and more closely associated with the Frankfurt School, this chapter has actually been very important in that respect. It's also very important if you want to understand what the utopian philosophy really is for Bloch. And he gives a very clear statement on that later on in the chapter, in the section on das Lösewort, and so we'll get to that later on. Because after this, this section on Kant and Hegel, we then get the introduction of the idea of the darkness of the living moment. So that in a way becomes the core of the theory of subjectivity. And that darkness of the living moment is then further explained or explored in the rest of the chapter. First, we get the dualism or the distinction between the not yet conscious, the no longer conscious, and the not yet conscious. So a discussion between, let's say, Freud and Bloch. Bloch positions himself when he talks about the darkness of the living moment and the not yet conscious in relation, in opposition to Freud. And he says Freud speaks about a regressive form of unconsciousness, namely a repression of that which once was conscious, whereas I'm speaking about a threshold of consciousness on the other side of the temporal axis, as it were, in which we are not yet conscious but have an inkling of something that is going to come. And he almost positions himself on the same level as Freud, but talking about the other edge of consciousness. And that becomes clear in those two sections on das nicht mehr bewusste and das noch nicht mehr bewusste, das noch nicht bewusste. Das noch nicht bewusste, the not yet conscious, has a central experience, and I think that's where we approach really the heart of the whole book, and that's the experience of wonder. Das Staunen. We find this, say more about this as we go on, we find this also time and time again in the rest of the writings, in crucial stages in Spuren, traces, but also in Das Prinzip Hoffnung. We get this reference to a fundamental experience of wonder in the face of the world, a metaphysical wonder at the fact that there is something at all rather than nothing, and how that what he calls an inconstructible question, which is the question of being in two senses. The question we ask of being is also a question that being asks of us. So radical openness at the heart of, at the beginning of subjectivity. That becomes the basis of, let's say, the idea of action, and also of the idea of creativity or creation, and of the Selbstbegegnung. Begegnung, so the encounter with self, which is an encounter with us, with we, with the community. So we need to explore that notion of wonder that is being expressed there. And then we're almost in the chapter, almost going down to this ultimate foundation, or not the foundation, but this groundless abyss of wonder. And then we come out again through the notion of das Lösewort, and the 1, 2, 3, 4 different forms that the way, not out of wonder, but the creation that can happen on the basis of this experience of wonder can take. First, there is a discussion of love, and also a discussion of das Weib, femininity. Then there is a discussion of Christ as the encounter between, we might say that das Weib mit Liebe is about eros, the section on Christ, or das aufgedeckte Angesicht, is about charity, caritas, is about agape, is another kind of love. And then there is a section on the tragedy, the tragic subject, and a section on das Bild zu sei, this poem by Schiller, in which the orientation in the absolute is then further elaborated. And so we get, let's say, in this part that deals with self-encounter, we've looked at art as a form of expression, and here we are now going into the theory of subjectivity as a theory of subjective expression, again, according to the orientation on the ultimate, the relation to, let's say, classical German philosophy, and then the introduction of the theory of subjectivity in terms of the darkness of the lived moment, and the central experience of that darkness of the lived moment in the experience of wonder, the practices to which that can inspire us or can lead us. That's how I very, very broadly think the chapter hangs together. There may be more to say about it, but just to give you a sense of orientation in it. Yeah. I would like to ask all of you, or those who feel that they want to speak about it, what your impressions of the chapter were, and I'll do that in a minute. I just want to point out a very nice little detail for us in terms of textual changes. So in this section on Kant and Hegel, right at the end, in the 1923 edition, on page 234, in the English, I don't know exactly where it is. I'll look it up. Can I quickly have a look at that? He speaks of the fact that we need both. We cannot. I think it's 186. Yeah, 185 at the bottom. Nevertheless, in the end, two types of conflict. Streiten hier zwei Typen, zwischen denen nicht nur zu wählen ist. Schon deshalb nicht, weil hier fern aller ausgemachten Alternative Kant nicht zu tun ist, wenn man das Hegelsche lässt. So we cannot do one and leave the other. We have to have both Kant and Hegel. Kant bleibt innerlich und unendlich, seine Forderungen verdämmen nur schwach inhaltlich in der Ewigkeit. Hegel allerdings wirkt dagegen als die glänzendere, großartigere, machtvollere, an Händel und Wagner gemahnende Erscheinung. And then it's almost the same in the 1918 version, but there he says Handel and Beethoven, which I think is very funny. As he rewrote it, he figured that actually Wagner has more to do with Hegel than Beethoven, which I think is very true. Because Beethoven is, of course, if you just think of the Ninth Symphony where you get Schiller's poem, that's a kind of Kantianism that is present there, Kantian aesthetic, the Kantian world of thought, as it were. And so he realizes that and changes it to Wagner, because Wagner has the comprehensive and impersonal view of the world that he sees in Hegel, and that he at once says is necessary, but also criticizes for its lack of concrete human subjectivity in it. But at the same time, we can understand why he makes this mistake. it's not a mistake, but why initially he can think that Beethoven is the one that he should be using as an example here of Hegel, because he's using the relation between Kant and Hegel to overcome the dichotomy between the subject and the object. It becomes a dialectic of subjectivity and objectivity, which ultimately has to result in a kind of whole. So he's trying to be both existentialist and speculative, and a speculative metaphysician, as it were. You might see Beethoven as somebody who tries to incorporate that in his music, although it's more Bloch that is Beethoven than Wagner, or than Hegel, and therefore I think later on Beethoven is removed and Wagner is introduced. I don't know why you put Handel there, because I don't think Handel has got any metaphysical depth at all. That's yeah. So I thought that's interesting. There are more little changes in that particular section that can be used to illustrate how thoughts and positions have changed over time. But that was going to be very detailed. So, okay, that's maybe enough of me talking now. Could I ask for some impressions or some questions or some points that you think we would have to discuss as we go through this chapter, so get a bit of a sense of what your findings have been.
As I said, a lot of future on the future philosophy or on the common philosophy.
Yeah.
And he thinks that Kant gave a reduced version of experience, and that experience is much more than Kant talked about.
Yeah.
And Bloch seems to go the same way in criticizing Kant for being too Newtonian, and he's limiting the experience to science experience.
Yeah.
And that's why he actually generalized the view that it's something to do with the West. And that's where you need the Orient, which the Orient almost magically connected with spirituality and religion.
Yeah.
So they got different point of view, and the Kantian is just scientific point of view.
Yeah.
That's how he starts the chapter. And I just saw the resonance of this with what actually Benjamin was talking about.
Yes.
And he goes on to talk about language as well. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. We can talk about that. And certainly the discussion of Kant leads directly into this discussion of the East. And he even speaks about Kantian framework as a Western thing, as a European thing, and visualizes Europe as a peninsula of the great continent. Sort of, yeah.
I think we on that point we could talk about so how Bloch uses these ideas of East and West, and also does vibe.
Yeah.
Maybe that's even easier to talk about because there's more concrete stuff in here. But you know, and that the chapter on das Vibe and Grund in der Liebe seems to me at once, you know, highly questionable at various levels, but also insightful as well.
Yeah.
Depending on how you want to read it and how it can be read.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's really a very important point. Yeah.
In the Kant-Hegel section, I guess what kind of surprised me is just if he was saying that you need both the sort of weightiness of the individual responsibility, but that without a larger whole that becomes kind of reductionist.
Yeah.
But the larger whole without that takes away our human role. What surprised me is I felt like, in feeling terms, his criticism of Hegel felt more real to me. It felt like he was really posing a challenge and saying that if it's too, you're not taking seriously enough the weight that is demanded somehow in the lived moment of us. And I don't know, I was surprised for it to feel it that way around.
I was also surprised at that. Mm-hmm. I felt like he was having a worse go at Hegel than he was at Kant.
Yeah.
And I think that later on you wouldn't find that as much, maybe, or I don't know.
That's right, yeah, I share that perception. It's almost, when you're reading it, you're thinking, yeah, I didn't really like Hegel that much.
Yeah.
But of course, he positions himself as a Hegelian.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
But I also liked that, because it kind of, it felt like, yeah, he was saying it can be too, and relating to the sort of east-west dynamic as well, like almost, if you go too far on the east, and it can be too easy. It felt like a real challenge somehow in that section.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's important. Also to ask why that wasn't the case with what he says about Kant, and why maybe he does much more with that philosophy and reads it in an unusual light. So the way what he says about Hegel is largely a rehearsal of Kierkegaard's points against Hegel. What he does with Kant is very different, and I think that was good to highlight that. Yeah. Any more points?
Yeah, I noticed that. I mean, this chapter, like all the other chapters, starts with pronouns. I mean, the book still starts with ich bin, wir sind, and this bit is ich bin and mir. I mean, I'm assuming this is drawn from, Lutheran theology or something. I mean, I'm not sure, but could you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I don't know anything about Lutheran theology, but obviously, yes, that is in the construction of the book is very important. It is a book about, in a way, if you want to put it like that, it is about the personal pronoun, because the utopian. And that becomes clear in this chapter, I think. He tries to make that clear. The utopian can only be conceived of under the emblem of an encounter between people. So with an encounter with oneself, but also an encounter with others. Selbst und Wir-Problem. And that's one of the achievements of the whole book, but certainly also of this chapter, to show that the idea of the utopian needs to be grounded in an idea of, I hesitate to say personhood, because I don't want to imply that Bloch is going to a kind of personalist ontology or something like that. But, and I think he doesn't do that himself either. But certainly to the pronoun, so to the form of address and to the indicative, pronoun as a singular indicative, or as an indicative of that person there, you, or me, or we. That is a very important aspect.
So it's not necessarily theological.
Well, this whole chapter it smacks of theology, isn't it? It is almost as if he's showing here what it means, this Blochian motive, what it means to inherit religion, because he uses all the religious language, and you could, I mean, if you were a Protestant theologian, you could feel very much at home. So how this can still be a form of atheism is a big question in a way, but I think it is. But he is inheriting religion. This is a chapter about religion. Previous ones were about art, but that is certainly the case, yeah, in my view.
I found this, having read more Bloch from later on, I find that he does take more kind of critical distance in the language from, he takes more care in his later writings to present the ideas as with a certain distance from any kind of straightforward religious content, whereas here I feel like he just uses those words as if it's simple to just use them, as an atheist or as a materialist, and I felt like it was kind of not presented as clearly as it sometimes is later on. But I mean, yeah, it's an important question as to how far you can kind of divorce it.
I thought very strongly that it was about religion, and that he gives a history of religion, we with religion, our inheritance of religion, and then going away from religion would make us empty. And so I must confess I haven't read the whole thing. So as far as I came, I had the impression that he wanted to say we must go back to religion.
Yeah.
But that was his message.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I haven't come across anything yet that I would call theological. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a clear appropriation of theological language and religious language. But it's appropriated. For me, it's appropriated in a philosophical way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean the criteria of discourse, and I think what the moves he's making are philosophical moves. He's appropriated theological language in order to perhaps kind of expand the parameters of that discourse as far as possible. But in the German tradition, I think that's quite constant.
Yeah, it's from Hegel onwards.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But I would say from this passage from themselves, there's a definite change of gear into a theological appropriation.
Yeah.
And specifically as well, the Luther Bible, it's interesting you mentioned Luther, but there's exact language from the Luther Bible. At the end of the second paragraph, sondern Schlange Lau und auch spielen anzusehen. That's from chapter 1 of the Book of the Apocalypse. And he says,
yeah, that's right. We are lukewarm.
And
it's also Matthew, I think, somewhere.
Yeah, and then halfway down there, the Verbluten and Gesegneten, they're the ones who are stolen and marked with the sign of the beast in the Book of the Apocalypse, which here is people who have become kind of tainted by the moneyed economy. Really apocalyptic kind of aggressive appropriation of different language.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just going to say as well, this Ich bin, wir sind motif, like the movement between them, for Bloch is, well, Johan, you were saying before about the beginning again in modern philosophy as a kind of almost a rhetorical gesture by now, that the movement of modern philosophy is to begin again. And I think that you could really read this as Bloch's kind of variation on that, or this is, for him it is also a rhetorical gesture that he kind of repeats everywhere. And I see it as a kind of beginning again in his style. Or
that's certainly there. There's also maybe just a little bit of sort of context in terms of Kierkegaard, of course, starts by saying, and he quotes that, we have, so the philosophical question is how do I understand, or how do I live? How do I relate to my own existence? How do I take my own existence upon me? And that requires religion as a leap into faith, and we'll get the whole discussion. But there's a turn towards the pronominal, the personal pronoun in Kierkegaard, in a way. Later in this context, a few years after Bloch, I think it's a very important question. A few years after Geist, Utopie, you get the publication of I and Thou, Ich und Du, by Buber, in which Buber makes the exact point that the ontological question, if you can put it like that, it doesn't use that language, but the ontological question can only be approached from the point of view of the first and the second person. So from the point of I and you, and not from the point of it. And in the lecture on metaphysics, Introduction to Metaphysics by Heidegger in the 1930s, so still later, Heidegger also talks about pronouns and says, rehearsing in a way his Kierkegaardian argument, that in Western philosophy as a whole, the predominant perspective has been the third person. So he, she, it, the objectifying stance. Whereas in existentialism, also in Heidegger's philosophy, which is not an extensivism, but in Dasein's analytical science side, the first and second person perspective cannot be reduced to a third person perspective. To put it, that's an analytical way of putting it. But I think that this status of the second and the first and second person, both singular and plural, is central in this respect, and is a way of showing that Bloch is working here with if you want to put it in those terms, the conception of being that is different from what we might say is the dominant discourse in the history of metaphysics. That point was also further elaborated. I referred to that in the beginning of the series by Levi. It's further elaborated by Levinas in his lectures on Bloch. There's a reference to that somewhere in the material. So I think the fact that the personal pronoun occurs here all the time is very important, precisely from that perspective. And again, it fits with the expressionist aesthetic and with the point, page 260. I think this is the central bit actually of the whole book there. Die bestehende Welt ist die vergangene Welt und das geistentleerte Objekt der Einzelwissenschaft. Aber die menschliche Sehnsucht in beiderlei Gestalt, das Unruhe und das Wachtraum, ist das Segel in die andere Welt. Dieses Intendieren auf einen Stern, eine Freude, eine Wahrheit gegen die Empirie, hinter ihren satanischen und erst recht hinter ihren Inkognito-Nacht, ist der einzige Weg, nach Wahrheit zu finden. Die Frage nach uns ist das einzige Problem, die Resultante aller Weltprobleme. Und die Fassung dieses Selbst- und Wir-Problems in allem, die Weltgeschwinge der Eröffnung, der Pforten der Heimkehr, ist das letztliche Grundprinzip der utopischen Philosophie. That is in the section on the possible. Shall I just quickly look where it's in English? I think that is so there you see that the whole philosophical question is reformulated in terms of the question about us, about the meaning of us, about das Wir-Problem. I'm going to find where this is.
So no to Hegel's subjective spirit then? It's all I and you.
No.
What pronouns Hegel's subjective spirit?
What pronoun?
Yeah.
Well, I don't even accept that way of formulating the way of thinking about it. I mean, if we're supposed to discover the secrets entirely from the subjective spirit, I think that's a hopeless course.
Right.
Because we're ignoring some of the secrets that the world has to give us.
I don't know whether I would read it quite like that, Bill. Well, I don't know. The way I see it is not so much that Bloch is ignoring the objective dimension, but that it's only possible to, but that in fact we are both subjective and objective, and it's only possible to engage with the question of being from the perspective of being this person in this society, in this body, or whatever it might be. So I think, do you see what I mean? I don't think it's necessarily a negation in that sense of an objective spirit, more that actually it's only possible to question that from the perspective of an I or we.
Well, that already seems to be a methodological limitation, saying that it's only possible to question things from the perspective of an I or you or we. But anyway, did we create the world?
No, well, I don't see what that has to do with the question of I mean, what's the purpose of that proposition?
Well,
let's read again what I just read, page 206. Now a little bit more. Can I read it out? Yeah? So if you can look at me. So read it in English now for the benefit of everyone. In the middle of the page. Here, in other words, in the wake of the comprehension of amazement. Have you got it?
yeah.
In the wake of the comprehension of amazement, so after on the base of the experience of the Staunen, that new, primordial, inmost evidence concept finally reappears, which simply does not take care not to edify, which confirms the primacy of practical mystical reason, even and precisely on the highest heights of metaphysics. So this is the Kant Hegel point, that pure subjectivity, the domain of practical reason, is reinserted into a metaphysical notion of metaphysical speculative thinking. The soul's thinking simply will not learn from its mistakes, but strikes out past every external and upper void. The existing world is the world of the past and the despiritualized object of science, but human longing in both forms, as in patience and as waking dream, is the mainsail into the other world. This intending toward a star, a joy, a truth to set against the empirical, beyond its satanic night, and especially beyond its night of incognito, is the only way still to find truth. The question about us is the only problem, the resultant of every world problem. And to formulate this self and we problem in everything, the opening, reverberating through the world of the gates of homecoming, is the ultimate basic principle of the utopian philosophy. Yeah. So in relation to Hegel, you might say that what is not given up is the idea of the totalizing movement, in which there is ultimately a homology or a uniformity between the subject and the object, or an identity. But that is achieved via, or the road that takes is via the human subject. So where Hegel says substance becomes subject, and takes that to mean the one subject of the world, spirit, if you want to put it like that. I think Bloch here, with the help of the return to Kant, says the only subjectivity there is the human subject, or perhaps there are other subjectivities as well, animal subjectivity, natural subjectivity. But this is an unfinished process, whereas the idea of an objective spirit would only make sense if the process was already complete, and if philosophy was just a form of remembering, of anamnesis, of innerhom, and he then goes on to discuss that in the rest of the section. So yes, there is a critique of the idea of objective spirit, but maybe more of its the concrete form that it takes in Hegel than of its ultimate inspiration or goal.
The way I sort of understood that bit as well is that, in relation to what you two were saying, I understood it as kind of we can only start where we are. So not a denial of objective spirit, but that for the sort of the journey to consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, to actually be experienced and be like a lived real experience has to come through the subjective point. Otherwise you're just kind of blindly accepting something. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, but most of world history is unfolded without anybody intending it. Okay, we don't want it to be like that, but we have to recognise that that is the case.
Well, but doesn't that kind of imply a defeatism or a quietism? I mean, why? Yeah, okay, but also people do act and do intend things and do change things, and that does have effects that aren't always immediately clear for any particular perspective. So there is another side, isn't there?
I guess what I'm finding problematic about Bloch is that he's saying that it's Hegel that's putting all this responsibility on us. But to me it seems the other way around, that it's Bloch who's putting all kinds of responsibilities on us that don't actually belong on us. You know, sort of, why haven't we resolved it? Why haven't we resolved it, you know? I mean, Hegel seems a lot more patient to me.
Yeah.
May I ask a quick question? It's to the point, I think, I hope. A question about the Gnosis des Ja. And it strikes me that at the very beginning here of the section, where he speaks of, where he says, die Seelen sind zunehmend so schonungslos und unbedingt geworden, dass uns Weihnachten, Ostern und Pfingsten wie ein einziger Karfreitag erscheinen, wie ein bloß trauriges, substanzloses Wissen, dass der Erlöser gestorben ist, etc. It seems to me that there's a really strong kind of affirmative Christological sort of drive here. And that the kind of fundamental opposition that he sets up here, and then again on page 216 in the 1923 edition, is one of the kind of, how should I say, a keen awaiting for, you know, the Messiah to be resurrected, if you like, versus nihilism. I mean, this seems to me the kind of fundamental dichotomy, right? The resurrection versus nihilism. And I wonder if then we bear in mind, as we said, that on some level, not accept Hegel's kind of totalizing movement of spirit, if it doesn't run the danger of being a kind of, you know, if this kind of affirmative moment doesn't run the danger of smoothing over, if you like, you know, real historical antagonisms and so on, and if you know, maybe we should keep the nihilistic moment, maybe we should keep the no as opposed to the.
Yeah,
you see what I mean?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so that's nice. Yeah, and it's also related to Phil's remark. So it's almost as if both from the affirmative dialectic and from the negative dialectic, you can criticize what's going on here. Yeah?
Is my feeling. I'm just not totally comfortable with the.
And so the charge would then be subjective idealism.
Yeah.
Yeah, as exactly as the censors in GDR also wrote about in their report on Bloch. It was subjective idealism, which is the letter we started with, the letter to Bloch, in which he actually says that. Right? So what has happened, and what is there anything here that can lead us away from reading this as subjective idealism, coupled with a kind of aesthetic? Another word, an alarming word in this context that Bloch uses here and in other places as well, is beschleunigung. So speeding things up. So he thinks it's important to speed things up, and that's almost it's almost like a futuristic manifesto that is coupled, and this notion of speeding up is ontologically significant. We can speed things up. It's not the case, perhaps, Phil, as Phil was saying, it's not the case that that Bloch is saying, yeah, why haven't we sorted our shit out yet? Well, we could have done it a long time ago, because he does recognize that the world has its own unclarities in it and is working things through. But that working things through is certainly not something automatic or objective. It has to take a certain shape. That's precisely the figure of hope, is precisely to create the idea of an openness that, yes, allows us to say, we are doing this, or we can do do something, while at the same time saying there's no guarantee. So the figure of hope seems to be connected to an idea of subjective agency or of agency that would make it possible to say, to slip into this discourse of speeding things up, also appropriating the theological language of you lukewarm, lazy bastards, whatever. That sort of, and that's the tone he adopts right from the start when speaking to this war generation. He's adopted that tone. He's adopting the tone of an Old Testament prophet, and in a way that's an affirmation of freedom, because it says you can do something. But the danger of it is that it puts too much weight on the subject, or on the individual agency, or on the yes, if you want to put it like that.
Bloch is clearly putting the emphasis more on the subjective than Hegel is. And in my view, that's because Bloch has not grasped from Hegel conceptual realism, namely that the universe is helping us. The universe is helping us. The universe is structured in such a way that we have the potential to realise our own potential. But to Bloch, it's something that's got to be done from the subjective side. So he's missing that aspect of Hegel, in my view.
I think that for Bloch, contingency or accident is important in the sense that in the essay that Habermas's review of Das Prinzip Hoffnung in the 70s, Habermas says, for Bloch it's all or nothing. It could all end in redemption, or it could end in catastrophe, but apocalypse, either way. And I think Bloch does take that seriously, that there is no guarantee, that there is no that there is a utopian tendency, or a tendency towards the better in the world and also in the human. But there is also a tendency towards nihilism, basically, and that both of those things are present, and that there is no guarantee. So I think he would reject the idea that, as you put it, the universe is helping us. I think that there is always for him that chance that it all just doesn't come together.
I think it's do you want to respond to that?
I think there is a chance that things won't come together. But
also for Hegel, or do you mean? Because that seems to be Bloch's, one of his criticisms of Hegel here seems to be that for Hegel, Hegel's system is a kind of necessary system, that it's constructed in the form of a kind of closed necessity, which he sees as a response to Kant, but thinks is wrong. That seems to be that's my interpretation of what he sort of criticises Hegel for.
Well, I would say that Hegel has given us all the philosophical categories that we need to realise our potential, but that doesn't mean that people are going to read Hegel well. And, from what I see, people don't read Hegel very well.
So it isn't all our own fault, after all.
Well, I think if we want to destroy ourselves, then we will.
Well, maybe even if we don't want to, and that's the point. That's the point. Maybe even if we don't want to, we will, because there are forces also in the world which are, beyond our immediate control and will remain that way for the foreseeable future, and also within our own being that we don't have access to or control over. And I think that's what the darkness of the lived moment for Bloch. I think I've got it here last week from my notes that I said this, and I think it's right now, looking at it just immediately again, that for him the darkness of the lived moment is that moment, the material moment, the Ansicht moment, if you like, of Sein as that which is other than Bewusstsein, but present in consciousness. So, and that's where we realise that actually we're not even transparent to ourselves. Well, Kant already says that, doesn't it?
Nietzsche says that. He says we're strangers to ourselves. It's part of the genealogy of morals.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but he means something quite different by that.
But actually, just as I was going to give, it seems to me that he was responding somehow. He was following Nietzsche somehow,
yeah.
but reversing Nietzsche against Nietzsche, because he thinks that the highest value has been devalued, and that we don't care now, and that we should go back to really caring about these values, or it becomes nihilist.
Yeah.
But he doesn't follow Nietzsche's analysis, and he starts to turn to this confrontation between Jerusalem and Rome, and he thinks to twist it back. He wants Jerusalem to win over Rome again.
Yes, that's right.
But Nietzsche actually thought that's where things were wrong.
Yeah.
Is what he calls it, the revolt of the slaves. Yeah. For him, the decline of the West was actually when Jerusalem, when Rome became Christian.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that,
I don't really know, because it's sort of a closing the circle.
Well, so the figure of Jerusalem, the name Jerusalem, is central to Bloch.
Yeah.
Obviously. So the one of the main gestalten of the utopian idea is the New Jerusalem. That's a biblical image. But Jerusalem is also the Orient. So when he says ex oriente lux, he means also Jerusalem. And there's another thing, he doesn't write it here, but he says it in other places. When he talks about Russia, ubi Lenin, ibi Jerusalem, where Lenin is, there Jerusalem is. Yeah? So he interprets it.
Regrettable formulation.
What?
Regrettable formulation.
Yeah.
I think it's a great formulation.
Could I just put a quick point? Was from the earlier position that the discussion, the conversation going about subject objectivity and coming into some of the Eastern thoughts or the Eastern philosophical systems, subject and object really doesn't exist, because their main theme is process is all. So if process is all, then the questions of subjectivity and objectivity becomes, just a thought, it becomes problematic. And the second aspect is in terms of realizing our potentials, all these kind of things. What you perhaps have also to take into considerations are the concepts of entropy and randomness and statistics. I mean, if you take this into account, it's like the quantum mechanics throwing a spanner in the works, because there would be a tendency of all systems for dissipation, right? So it is dissipation. So the attempt to reduce entropy, by ordering ourselves is problematic, because however much you try to order, the natural tendency of thermodynamics is to disorder. So that will have an impact on this ultimate thinking.
That's true. Yes, that's true.
Bloch talks about entropy.
Bloch talks about entropy quite a lot. Yes, but this is really interesting. How these are. So we're going from Christology to entropy. That's a big thing, but it is definitely related. And Bloch talks about entropy and formulates one of the main challenges to the utopian idea, the utopian philosophy, in terms of the anthropic warm, what is it called, Kaltestod des Universums, the death of the universe. And I don't know, you can know more about it than I do. You always go on about entropy.
I always go on about it, but I don't know anything about it.
I think that what Bloch has in mind is that there are these jumps to another level. That
emergent somehow.
And that also we can jump out of the material. So the material universe has to be redeemed in some sense or other, which is still materialist. But otherwise, if that doesn't happen, then everything dies.
But I think there's also another tendency, isn't there? So the tendency of entropy really describes, or you could say really describes at the level of physics, what we call the passage of time. There isn't so much a notion of time except for this concept of dissipation and things moving from a more ordered state to a less ordered state. But there is a tendency that runs counter to that, which is the organisation of life. Because life organises itself, seems to organise itself in more and more complex forms. And so again, there is that contrary tendency, which I think, obviously Bloch isn't proposing that any of that is clear what that means, but that question is there.
It's a real question for the materialist, and I also think that the relation to subject and object is definitely thought of in a processual way. So we should resist the inclination to reify those two poles of the process. I think the thinking here is very much related actually to how subjectivity and objectivity are constructed in Whitehead's process philosophy, where they are two poles of an occurrence, of an event. An event starts with a subjective pole and then ends up objectified, handing itself over to another concrescence, as he calls it, another growing together of the universe in one event.
Bloch uses the word concrescence in this chapter as well. I can't remember where it is now, but he used it because I noticed that.
Oh, all right,
Can I just quickly try to address Phil's question from earlier? You seem to be suggesting that Bloch is insufficiently Hegelian on some level. I would say the opposite. I'd say he's still too Hegelian. I would prefer the Benjaminian alternative, trying to shut down the dialectic and let the kind of rifts and crevices, let the messianic age break in or something like that. I think that it's still too deterministic. There's still a bit of a promise of a resurrection or something. That's what I mean, also by a affirmative kind of Christological moment. I mean, I see and appreciate, despite the kind of futuristic moment, the critique of this kind of promise. There is no necessary detriment in history, but I think that we can take this further as Benjamin does. Let's say still too Hegelian rather than not Hegelian enough, if you see what I mean. Because I think that Hegel really runs the promise of a strong kind of deterministic moment there.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's definitely reconciliation on the horizon. I think
it has already happened in a way.
Exactly.
Just well, not in agreement overall, but just in relation to your thing that I feel like for Bloch, the darkness of the lived moment is very much associated with wonder and the amazement and utopian longing and possibility, but I guess what you're saying, it could equally be associated with dread, and like if the responsibility is really there in that, it could kind of be, like I see what you mean, that he takes it as forgiven, something that it thinks in that direction.
We were talking about this just before, and I was saying that I think that Staunen, the role that Staunen or wonder plays for Bloch, and also there's a parallel with la nausée, in Sartre, like nausea and the dread of, so that's the response, to existence, and I think for Bloch, Staunen also plays that kind of role.
Staunen is the experience of the groundlessness of being, and it's experienced here as, and maybe that's where this question, this Hegelian question plays a role. It is experienced here as something that, and that's why this word Frage is so central, that asks something of us. So the hermeneutical interpretation of wonder is, the understanding of it is as a question, and that's also in the word wonder, of course. I wonder. Yeah, there is a question which is asked of us in this experience. What is it? What does it mean? Who are we? What is the world? but it's also, so it's a question is asked of us, but it's also we are asking a question of the world. And he says there's this parity. He says the world is the question, we are the answer. We are the question, the world is the answer. And that is movement. That's history, anyway. In existentialism, in Sartre, it starts with Heidegger. Heidegger says, das Staunen, he literally says this, Taumatzen, which is Staunen in Plato. Plato says, wonder is the beginning of philosophy. Heidegger says literally, wonder is no longer available to us. It is not an experience that we have. What takes the place of wonder is the experience of pure facticity, and that is la nausea. That is nausea. So we just experience this radical facticity of things without rhyme or reason in a way, and that's where the project of when the projection of the self begins. That's where life begins, or where human life begins. So there is a fundamental question here: how do we interpret this experience? And I think Bloch is very clear, and I think Edward is very clear about the fact that here somehow argumentation at some point stops. So if you cannot experience being as wonder, or if you cannot experience being as nausea, then the road of these philosophies is in a way closed up for you. And I think that's a very fundamental point. And it may help to also make these criticisms of positions a little bit more subtle, because of course you can say to Bloch, yeah, this is still too deterministic, etc. But of course, once you accept the experience of wonder, then I think there's little determinism in this philosophy. It can go in all sorts of directions, but the ja, so the acceptance, or the saying yes, is there, is in the fundamental experience of being as an experience of wonder, or an experience of question, an experience of something being asked of us or of the world, rather than redemption as a figure of a breaking in, of a rupture that destroys history as we know it. And so it seems to me that maybe, I don't know, but maybe Benjamin's fundamental ontological experience is closer to an experience of facticity than an experience of wonder. I don't know. Do you have any views on that? Or?
I'm one enough, I won't get back to you.
Yeah.
Phil,
you want to
say? Just a couple of things. On Hamill's thing about entropy, if you ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing, which Heidegger asks, but absolutely doesn't get anywhere on at all. If you ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing, the answer that makes the most sense to me is God's love. And on the question of Benjamin, see, I think Benjamin, I've just thought of a Benjamin seminar. I think Benjamin is, you know, I don't object to the very fragmentary nature of Benjamin's work, but if Benjamin is saying Hegel's teleology is not there, then I think there's something wrong with Benjamin's method. That's what I'd say about that.
Okay, see you next time. Yeah. Okay, I think we should maybe... See you next time. Yeah?
Yeah, see you next time.
I think we should go back to this discussion of this Christological point in order to get a bit more clarity. So the beginning of the section on the Alexanderzug, because there's an interesting thing occurring in the beginning where he speaks of, in understanding nihilism, where he speaks of a destruction in the center, basically of the inability to have faith. I think that's how he understands this. Vielleicht glaubte, so on page 212, vielleicht glaubte Nietzsche zu Reichen, was sagte, vielleicht auch Schopenhauer, der gewaltig Erlebende, vielleicht auch Spinoza, more geometrico. Aber allen fehlt das tiefste mit hineingerissen sein. Und der Tag von Damaskus ist nicht zu ersetzen. Auch Kierkegaard glaubte nur an das Glauben können. Auch Dostojewski hat das Gift der Großinquisitorszene keineswegs überwunden. Und wie Luther bekennen musste, nur zweimal an Gott geglaubt zu haben, so findet sich in Pascals Apologie des Christentums der ehrliche Satz, dass es immer noch vorteilhafter sei, auf das Dasein Gottes und das Gericht zu setzen, als auf das Nicht-Dasein, ein Argument der Wette, das sich nicht so zuredend, abwägend, versicherungshaft, so ganz und gar anders als die mittelalterlichen Gottesbeweise an den Verstand hätte wenden können, wäre nicht auch bei Pascal die unbedingte Glut erloschen. And then you get what we already looked at, so Eastern, Ostern, Pfingsten und Weihnachten, Ostern und Pfingsten erscheinen wie ein einziger Karfreitag. So the inability to really believe what you say is what is being spoken about here. And it is predominantly framed in terms of a problem of philosophy. Because all the philosophers mentioned here, and so he says all these philosophers couldn't really believe what they said. Allen fehlte das tiefste mit hineingerissen sein, und der Tag von Damaskus ist nicht zu ersetzen. And that is the predicament with which it starts. So yes, there is an appropriation of theological language. But the problem here is the problem of the inability to commit this leap of faith, as it were.
The inability to commit in the faith of a very real theodicy. I think this is what concerns me. You know, that it's kind of smooths over this.
The problem of evil.
Yeah. I think it's a very justifiable point of departure to not. Yeah. I mean, this is my kind of contention here. So he's saying, let's set that aside for a moment and believe that, sticking with the kind of real, religious imagery, that the resurrection can and must come or something. Which I'm sympathetic to that point somehow, but I want to. I don't want to talk him down too much. I feel fundamentally on board. I just wonder if he's kind of overstating the case.
He might be overstating the case. It's interesting. There's good literature on the theodicy and Bloch, on which this point is made, that he doesn't fully give enough weight to the problem of evil. He wants to say something. No. Well, how does he get out of this? What's his way out of this? This whole book is, of course, part of the stylistic effect of it is an attempt to really believe what you say, and maybe that doesn't even work at all points. Maybe he's shouting very loudly just to make himself believe what he says at some points. But I think that the argumentative structure here is to say, well, this actually affords us, this situation is what can put us in touch with an understanding of longing, of Sehnsucht, of desire.
And that's the longing to be honest.
The longing to be honest, yeah. And he says, so to go on a bit, where is it? Aber dieses, to the end of this section, aber dieses gerade ist, was uns andererseits wiederum fühlen lässt, dass in unserem seltsam matten und trüben Leben ein wichtiges nicht stimmt. So there's a negative experience there. We know that this is not right. Geblieben ist zumindest die Verzweiflung, dass wir nicht glauben. Dass der inwendige Mensch halb stehen bleibt, bloß erkenntnismäßig bewegt und angezogen, geblieben oder sogar verstärkt ist aber auch die Ahnung unserer verdeckten Kraft, unseres latenten Aufgangs und Morgenlands, so that's the East, unseres gediegenen, endlich enthüllsten, endlich allernächst herangerücktes Besitzens. So he seems to be saying not so much that there is an affirmative stance that we can simply adopt in opposition to nihilism to overcome it or to deny it, but it is precisely the experience of nihilism that affords us ex negativo with the idea that there must be something else. And then he says, oh, and that is an experience of Sehnsucht, is an experience of longing. So this emptiness is experienced as something that is not, that should not be there, or that might not be there, or that could be otherwise. And that is exactly the parallel structure to the analysis of wonder, of das Staunen, which also gives us something to ask.
Ja, he says also here on page 216, aber daraus zu gleich entsteht der paradoxe Mut, gerade aus dem Nebel das Licht zu sein. This is a wonderful moment, I think, but yes. But it seems to me still a little bit to run counter to some of the imagery. I mean, if this is indeed the case, if this is, as you said, that this kind of experience of nihilism, the experience of the false, if you like, points to the to something more, if you like, then yes. But then I wonder if maybe that's not completely continuous with the choice of imagery. But if that is philosophically indeed the point, then well, yeah.
I think that must be the point. Yeah.
So, just to understand, are you interpreting him as as you say, appropriation of theological language? Are you interpreting him completely denying a sort of Hegelian, a bigger faith in becoming in a certain direction, and that he's just using that language but putting it all on us? Or do you think that there's an element of both? That's not articulated very clearly.
I'd say that, I mean, my concern was, I'm not saying that this is necessarily true, or my reading is keen enough to really see that, but I'd say that he's still too Hegelian. That the Christian imagery kind of links with a kind of deterministic Hegelian teleology that promises, kind of historical betterment. And if that is indeed the case, as it doesn't appear to be, thankfully.
But you think he isn't?
And I'm reasonably convinced by what you said. And if indeed the point is that you read a kind of a premonition of a better condition from the experience of the force, then this is fantastic. But in that case, I'm a little bit still uncomfortable with the imagery of resurrection and so on. I think it still holds too much promise. But maybe that's just retroactively reading Bloch from the standpoint of
yeah. I mean, this is it's almost the last aphorism in Lingua Moralia. That's the thing here. Yeah. My question with it is, what good does it do? How does it? So suppose we say, from false we know the longing for the truth, for the truth. What does that inspire us to, or if anything, what does it do for us? Does it do anything for us? He seems to be saying towards the end of the chapter, das Lösewort, there are directions that we could take from this. The direction of we have to talk about that, love in the form of eros and agape, Christ, tragedy, and also then its orientation on the ultimate. How does that work?
Well, I don't know how that works, or if this is a response directly to the question of how it works, but maybe it helps to kind of think again about the context in which Bloch writes this book. And so, one of the things that you see again and again in philosophy and all everywhere, movement of kind of response to something which has come before, which is, you might say, a bit overzealous. And I think Bloch, this book is a response to the generation of the First World War, and I think that there is a kind of rhetorical or social purpose already in the way that he writes this, of radically just challenging the belligerence and destruction that he's witnessed there. Yeah. And I think that you can see that also a little bit in the Kant and Hegel chapter, where I think Bloch puts the emphasis here on practical reason and on the practical on the power of practical reason as a kind of call to act. And this part here that you just read out, I mean, that you see already foreshadowing what comes in the Marx section. So that already starts to sound a little bit Marxist. And I think what he does, I mean, we talked about faith, so taking a leap of faith. I think with Bloch, longing or desire, the metaphysics of longing or desire, take on the character of hope rather than a faith or love, or that post-theologically, longing desire takes on the character of hope. So there is a disappointability inherent in that. And your question was, what do we do with that? I mean,
so is that the basis, and in what sense is that the basis, let's put it in classical terms, of an ethics, or of a political?
Well, you could turn the question round against, people like Pierre Bourdieu, who is on the left but completely disposes of aesthetics. I don't think socialism is possible with just loaves and fishes. I mean, you need whatever you want to call it. I mean, Bloch calls it utopia, some might call it the aesthetic or fantasy or whatever. I think socialism is seriously crippled if you're simply a positivist and just engage in a very practical, sensible way with power struggles. I mean, because at some point you've got to ask yourself, what's the point? And the point can only be provided by by art, fantasy, whatever.
Die Armen brauchen mehr als zu fressen, das bricht das.
Exactly. And that's and Bloch tries to provide that in a way. So whereas there is maybe a curious sympathy between positivism and the strong version maybe of sort of a Benjaminian Adornite negative dialectic, in which every imagination of what might be is precluded as inherently exposed to the danger of alienation
but this is a kind of negative imagination though, isn't there? I mean, Adorno and Benjamin don't do away with it in the same way. Because Bourdieu completely writes off aesthetics as a discipline. It's complete sociological imperialism.
Sorry, not too late. Far too late. It's almost
Oh right, is it over?
5:30.
5:30.
No, it's a minute.
Are you sure?
Yeah, sure.
Because what hangs in the balance, of course, in Adorno is happiness.
Yeah.
That's the kind of utopian, metaphysical, and materialist. I mean, this is where all these motifs converge from horizon. So it's a question after the possibility of metaphysical experience of the present, and it's a kind of an inverted experience through suffering or something like that. So it's suffering rather than revelation. It's again, speaking with the religious imagery, it's a Judaic rather than a Christian kind of context.
I think I mentioned this last time as well, but I think with Bloch, so the Christ figure and like the Christological language is also, so here is kind of, he's developing a kind of theory of the subject, if you like, and I think that that motif in him also connects up with so it's the suffering of the body that we see in the Christological subject, you might say, which for him forms the basis of a kind of materialist theory of subjectivity, not a million miles away from Adorno's theory.
He talks about the resurrection of the flesh and
So although he's doing it in his language here is a lot more emphatic than anything we find in Adorno, I think there is a deeper connection there.
Perhaps I hadn't thought of it like that. Yes.
Yeah, so can we just read a little bit on page 217 in this context, just to see what he actually says. Yeah, so at the sixth line is so from the top there. Das Leben geht uns und weiß nicht, wohin es geht. Nur wir selbst sind noch Hebel und Motor. Der Stock der Äußerung, das Recht der offenbarte Sinn. That's a repetition at the beginning of the book. So life has become life träumt hin und her, meaningless, and we have to become its best. Aber der neue Gedanke bricht endlich hinaus in die vollen Abenteuer, in die offene, unfertige, träumende Welt, in die Verschüttungen und Finsternis des Satans, der Abriegelung selber. Auch mit Verzweiflung gegürtet, mit unserer trotzigen Ahnung, mit der ungeheuren Gewalt unserer Menschenstimme Gott zu ernennen und nicht eher zu ruhen, als bis die innersten Schatten vertrieben sind, bis die Welt mit jenem Feuer übergossen wurde, das hinter der Welt ist oder angezündet werden soll. And then he says, und doch erst angezündet werden soll. This fire behind the world has to be poured over the world, has to be lit yet. Denn wir brennen noch nicht frei und nichts eben ist auch an sich bereits völlig echt. Geblieben also ist auch jenseits des Nebels die Verzweiflung. Auch jenseits, so even beyond the fog, there is Verzweiflung. An nichts recht zu glauben, erst noch ahnen zu müssen und lediglich damit ans Ende zu sehen, den Weg zu schließen. Es ist letzthin doch noch nicht völlig so, als ob das Reiz der Echtheit und Gediegenheit in uns bereits entdeckt wäre und nur durch den gleichzeitigen Exzess vollendeter Sündhaftigkeit und Immanenz als der negativen Transzendenz verborgen würde, als ob mithin Musik und Eingedenken der Neuzeit immer näher das Unbedingte umkreisend, das Allerechteste, Allergediegenste bereits aus dem Nichtwissen und dem Irrweg der Welt hervorgerettet hätten. Sondern trotz alles bedeutenden Vertrauens auf das Dasein von ständigen eigenen Orienten in der Neuzeit, das ist a very interesting phrase, the Oriental in modernity, als den Zeugnissen des unerstickten Heilprozesses in der Seele, unser inwendigstes selber liegt eben auch jenseits des wesenlosen Nebels noch im tiefen Schatten, inkognito seiner selbst, in einem moralisch-metaphysischen Inkognito, wie es nicht nur sozial an das Achten oder Nichtachten lediglich als letzthin widerruflich unter Vorbedacht reflexiv ausdrücken lässt, sondern erst recht in der ethisch produktiven Selbst- und Wir-Verdeutlichung die tiefste Echtheit, den Zusammenschluss unserer Intensität mit sich selbst, das Wiederantreffen und die Deckung ihrer hinter der Vision keineswegs total gelingen lässt. Okay, the long sentences. But
it's awful, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's really awful. Yeah.
So hard to read.
That was the 10 months one.
Yeah. But the point is that as a further qualification of this sort of criticism of it still being too Hegelian, there is sort of the recognition, which I think is an important one, that even behind the fog, even if we have overcome that, there is still a further incognito, a further not yet at the heart of the subject. In Principle of Hope, this becomes much clearer when he speaks of the historical process, which is a form of not yet, but there is also an aspect of the self that has not yet even entered into the historical process. And that is where the question of death becomes relevant, because the confrontation with death is the experience of something not having gone into the historical process, and therefore also being beyond, as much beyond life as beyond death, therefore containing the promise of something beyond death.
Because otherwise it would just be
otherwise it would be
flat ideology critique, you're doing away with the myth and getting to the...
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not that, but it's very important in order to see that this mystery, this Geheimnis that we spoke about has got two floors, as it were. There is first of all there is the noch nicht, the not yet in history, and then there is the not yet of that which has not even entered into history. And that is a fundamental point. So without that, indeed, it becomes a futuristic manifesto. Yeah? And that is hinted at here, I think. It'll come back later in the chapter on the apocalypse, Marx, and death, because that's what that deals with. Okay, shall we go to the discussion of das Weib und Grund in der Liebe? The woman.
What's gedieven, or gediegenheit translated as?
Who can check that?
Do we know?
Isn't it?
Can you check it? Somebody in the English can check it.
Isn't it good? Isn't it?
Right at the beginning, the very beginning of the chapter,
No.
not the first. So
Gediegenheit
the
is
second
solidity.
What is genuine?
Solidity, genuineness.
Right. Okay.
Gedegen in Dutch.
This is firmness. Last week German wrote. It's firmness.
Firmness.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, something like that. That's solidity, firmness. Yeah. What is it translated as in the book?
Genuine. What is genuine in us?
What is genuine in us? Yeah. Okay. It is actually related to Tugend, deugd, virtue. Yeah. So what is the Dutch word degelijk means, quality, good quality. Yeah. Okay, so the chapter on, we're moving forward very quickly. We're going to different versions of this Lösewort. Anyway, so he has this idea, that's on page 261. Zugleich aber wurde betont, dass hier utopisches Gewissen zu walten hat, dass also nicht bereits schon ein Inventar fest aneinandergefügter Symbolintentionen und ihrer Spezies eine förmliche Summa Ontologiae contra immanentes aufstellen lässt, vielmehr umkreisen sämtliche moralisch-mystischen, also ontischen Symbole nur in einem weiten Wegnetz das eine Urwort, die oberste Symbolspezies des sich bildenden Löseworts, wie diese wieder näher das noch unartikulierte Urgeheimnis, den Kern der gelebten Intensität, der mystischen Seelenintensität an sich selbst umgibt. So, and that's the core, we're going to be talking about that, but around that core there is this Urwort which symbolically mentions it, and that has got different forms or different Gestalte in which it occurs on the road towards realization. And one of them is love. The love between the sexes. Das Weib und Grund in der Liebe. And this is a very strange short text, which actually in the 1918 version is considerably longer than here. He cut out even a lot of the parts that even by the time you reviewed this were probably no longer really defensible.
Some gender studies person might break in somewhere.
Oh yeah. This is well. There is a very good book on. It's called, what's it called again? Catherine. What's her name again? No. On Bloch, on the sexual utopias.
Oh, Katrina Nedwiel.
Yeah, Katrina Nedwiel, who's written a book on sexual utopias from Hobbes from Thomas More to Bloch or something like that. Hobbes to Bloch. She writes about this in details. It was published a couple of years ago. It's very good. Yeah. So we can have a longer discussion in Bloch's work with feminism, of course, because that is part of the whole history of socialism and history of communism as Bloch sees it. And I think maybe you can say that first of all, Bloch is quite sort of traditional romantic when he writes about love. as pointed right out, Eros. Eros, of course, a key motive for Bloch, because the whole philosophy is in a way a philosophy of desire. But he seems to very often take the line. He also says this. He was of course supporting feminism in the earlier stages, but was also critical of it in that he said they want a bigger slice of the pie, but they don't want to change the recipe. So he felt that this is quite, has its roots in German Romanticism and Goethe, etc. He felt that one of these Gestalten, one of these categories under which to capture the utopian was the feminine. And the feminine as such resists alienation, reification, vernieuwing, resists that. And he felt that was an important aspect to keep. And therefore, in this section on das Weib und Grund der Liebe, I think you have on the one hand this ultraviolet horizon of unalienated humanity, which is, he uses the word androgynous there, and he also says in the end that is a feminine shape. And then there is much more at the forefront, much more concrete level. There is a discussion of the relation between men and women in alienated society, as it were. And there's also a very speculative biological theory of why people, why there is a difference in.
So what is that?
Yeah, why there is a sexual difference, why there are men and women at all, and rather than that we like plants, or that we would just once every 500 years, he says, you might imagine that once every 500 years a love couple will be born, and between those occurrences, people would just be grafted upon one another, as it were. So why isn't that the case? Why isn't that the case? And he says it's more than just the fact that there's no DNA wasn't of course there, but there is a sort of inheritance theory behind it. It's not just the case that two strands of genetic material have to be passed on. It is more, love is a theological state and not a biological state, he says somewhere. And that gives him an indication. Yeah?
It's very kind of Dante's, I think, the structure behind this.
Yeah.
In the sense that only Beatrice can lead Dante up to the upper reaches of heaven.
Yeah.
In her femininity, which is quite emblematic and symbolic of the human soul, the high reaches of the soul and subjectivity.
Yeah.
And at the top is the love which moves the earth and all the stars.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's just shot through reading Dante, I think.
Yeah,
so that from the chapters from Dante as well, no? So this would seem intended.
Occupies we don't know about, that's the thing.
And there's a quote at the beginning of the chapter, another Dante quote.
Yeah, at the beginning of the whole chapter, huh?
Yeah. And then at the beginning of the book there's a famous Dante.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's Beatrice, it's also Mary. It's also, there's a reference to Eckhart saying what the whole universe could not comprehend is now in Mary's womb. And there is of course also Goethe, so Faust, Gretchen and Faust is also there.
There also seems to be a reference to the Hebrew Bible, and the whole story of Sarah and Abraham, Adam and Eve too, and everything.
Yeah.
Go back to
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Adam and Eve is there as well. Yeah. So it's this idea of the couple, of the pair. A later text which is in Atheism and Christianity deals with this idea of the das hohe Paar, the high couple. It speaks about marriage there as well. And he mentions that here too.
What I find the reason I want to talk about this chapter is because there's this very strange mix of ideas which by now are just kind of really indefensible almost, Well, so there's, I don't know, at some point he says, he speaks in very sort of indicative language, saying, yeah, das, der Mann und das Mädchen, like describing where is that now?
Ganz am Beginn, ja. Man wird in verschiedenem Tempo reif zur Liebe. Und die Luft zwischen Mädchen und Mann ladet sich erheblich früher mit dem je verbindenden Blitz, als eine Seele solch verwirrende Ladung zum Tisch begreifen kann. So the body is ready for love long before the soul is. And then there's also a difference, so he speaks about the girl and the man, not about the girl and the boy, or the woman and the man. Yeah, it's
completely heteronormative, isn't it?
It's totally sexist. Yeah,
it's in the neuter case, which I think.
Das Weib is neuter, yeah.
But Mädchen as well. And I think that's quite significant because, I mean, if he's using the feminine as something symbolic or something transcendent and something to do with subjectivity, and being able to put it into the that was also the point that I was going to make because.
But all diminutives are neutral.
Yes, that's right, but vibe is not a diminutive, and it doesn't matter that it's the fact that that Mädchen is a diminutive is almost doesn't take away the point that it makes it easier to use it in a symbolic way.
What's the non-diminutive?
Old. It's an old. It's a very old diminutive.
That's never occurred to me that there's a relation between
math and nature.
Might. Yes. It's a word that Wagner likes to use. Yeah.
He would. This is also this Weib und die Liebe is so. Love is centered in him.
Yeah.
So it's not, he is talking about
his experience of love,
and it only exists from this center, he himself.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think that's right, but I don't think that means that, I think even he also is using these ideas with a more ontologically significant meaning. I think he also sees that himself, or it seems that way to me, although you can read this in a very sort of, by now, conservative and outdated way. That's why I find it so problematic.
Yeah, so there's also no discussion of homoerotic love, of course.
No, but that's what I mean, from our perspective now.
Although Bloch had a homoerotic relationship as a young child, as a teenager with somebody else.
But so if you read, from what I would be interested to see is from a position in which you would say that whatever we consider to be the male and female as philosophical categories, that they are present in all people and all. If you consider it in that way, so
sorry to interrupt you, but that's exactly the point. That's his reason. This is very speculative. That's why he says there is the female and the male, because that allows us to become androgynous. So that's the reasoning. I think that he is developing here. He says there is the male and the female, so that we can unify them both in ourselves. Which seems very strange because, why have it at all then? Because but it's a dialectical thing. There's something that goes apart and then comes back. And he says it literally here on 264. Eben als angebende mit dem Menschen in the middle, sich ganz eigentlich erst erreichende Funktion auf die Geburt eines Menschenkinds, vor allem aber auf den Gewinn der doppelgeschlechtlichen Urgestalt der Liebenden selbst bezogen.
Isn't that a kind of a mystical idea about sort of self-realization that sort of prefigures Jung, the idea that
this is Jung's idea,
harmonise with our feminine side or masculine side, and the question of wholeness, and it's quite kind of well established in esoteric literature and mysticism.
I think that's what it is.
I mean, I think one might need to be careful for excusing Bloch. I mean, if you have an issue with his stuff on gender and sexuality here, I mean, to write it off as being a product of the time, he strikes me as someone who's quite kind of astute and sensitive and has his finger on the pulse, and there's lots of stuff going on in terms of people being quite radical in terms of their understanding of gender and sexuality at this time. So, I don't know, I mean, if he's being a bit conservative here, I would imagine it's quite difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what it is. I wonder whether it's deliberate, if it's just his personal view, or if there's a point to it, or, you know, that's what I find it quite mystifying myself, this whole thing, because,
it's about his situationness in tradition, and his view of cultural development and the importance of history and things, and his use of the Gothic and musical and aesthetic ideas from the Gothic era kind of does tie him to certain ideas on gender and sexuality, which are quite difficult to get out of, perhaps.
Yeah, possibly.
But he certainly was aware, maybe not here, but certainly when he wrote Prinzip Hoffnung, he was aware of all the positions, because he writes about all the different forms of feminism that were current in his time, and he reviews them all. But that was a lot later than this.
So what's his position on gender in the 60s, where it was obviously...
This was written in
1918.
Yeah, and then Ampersand was this, to think 1918, and then he says, was mit den beiden Menschen nach dem Geschlechtsakt geschehen soll, durch Ehe und Formulisten gelöst werden könnte.
Yeah.
1918, I mean, the women in 1918, poor thing. I mean, it's from the men's point of view.
Yeah. Is that from the men's point of view?
Yeah. That he has first the Geschlechtsakt, and then he thinks what should happen now.
Well, you know, here, so let me just, if I can say a bit about it. He says, 262, at the bottom where he says, what should happen to people after the copulation? That's it.
Have a cigarette.
Have a cigarette. No, you can have a cigarette, but it's more noble to marry. That's literally what it says. Durch Ehe am vornehmsten gelöst wird oder werden könnte, durch ihren festlichen Alltag, it's festive every day, it's volle sexuelle Mitverantwortlichkeit, it's full sexual co-responsibility by the aristocratic becoming old of erotic relations as the only possible Altersstil der Liebe. And I think that gives us an indication of what he's talking about. We've seen that word Altersstil earlier when he was speaking about Beethoven's late string quartets and Rembrandt and people like that, where he says, will you remember that when he speaks of form and freedom in composition, and he says a composer does not have to use any formal tonal structures at all. He can do whatever he wants, and that up until now, that is something that we've only seen in the Altersstil, in the style of. And you see it he writes about it in other places. You see it in Beethoven in his late works. You see it also in philosophy, in the late dialogues of Plato, in the late paintings of self-portraits of Rembrandt. And you get something special that is beyond form. And I think that is what he has in mind here. So if an erotic relationship becomes old, then it also moves into that region. And therefore something, so he seems to say, and he says it when he writes in other places about this, it becomes, with time, things become possible that are not possible if you do not have that duration in a let's say, a sexual relationship. And that is, I think, what he has in mind here. As in itself, and that's of course always what happens, a utopian form. So the erotic relationship itself has a utopian dimension, has got an unknown aspect to it that requires, in a way, sticking with it in order to get there. But of course,
I don't have a problem with him saying that, but
to imply that that's the only thing that you can do, or rather, and that there are not many ways, there's not a whole multiverse of erotic relationships that
and non-erotic relationships and all kinds of you know, it just doesn't sit well with his. I know it's a lot earlier, and I take your point, and I think that's important that it's kind of reading it through, and the Alter Stil reference makes that clear that there is a kind of cultural.
When does the Alter Stil start?
But
You're not there yet.
I'm really completely different, and I feel that he doesn't know what happens to women when they get old.
No, he doesn't, but I don't have a problem with him. I don't have a problem with him writing from the perspective of who he is. I mean, that's fine. He writes from the perspective of who he is, and so does everybody else, right? But it doesn't sit well with his radical politics, does it really?
No, I was really shocked by it.
Yeah. I find it like, I mean, I don't know what Bloch's position is on feminism or how it votes, but I don't find it that mystifying or shocking that a man is, in every other regard, incredibly, overwhelmingly radical, insightful, mystical, and just kind of, in terms of actual male-female relationships, just sort of gets it a bit wrong. And doesn't see the other aspect. I mean, I think maybe we're looking too much for metaphysical ways of interpreting his just ignorance, maybe, in terms of actual male-female.
Gosh.
That sounds cynical, but it does, like...
Yeah, so you're more saying that just ignore this, or...
Well, not ignore it, but it's not shocking that male writers... It's not shocking to me, given his time and gender, that, I mean, it would be shocking to me, it would be more surprising to me had he seriously considered the actual perspective of a woman in a love encounter.
Yeah.
I don't know, I guess that sounds cynical, but
it does feel like it feels a bit more deliberate to me. It doesn't feel like just an arbitrary accidental, you know, this is 1918 and this is what we're on. Because even if, I mean, just that passage there, if you put that next to Goethe, Bloch would seem more conservative than Goethe. But even Goethe has ideas of spontaneous, erotic love, and there's quite questioning about marriage and things like that. And this, I mean, that's just, even on that spectrum, it makes him look really quite conservative.
Yeah.
I mean, is it maybe just a conservative kind of like personal romantic ethics?
Maybe, or it's more the pointing towards the mystical and anything to do with concrete ideas of gender and sexuality.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is there too. But
that's the reason.
That's right. So the idea of Hochzeit, German for marriage, is used in a general sense by Bloch in several places. A high time. A sort of a climax or an apex of some sort, and it's related to this idea of the chemische Hochzeit, the Rosenkreutzian idea of a chemical, the sort of mixture of elements, and also he also uses the symbol of the what he calls the Südsugie. I don't know how to translate that into English. Where he uses this image in astral myth. There is this image of the moment when sun and moon are in the sky together at the same time. That's Hochzeit, and he uses that so that is related to his understanding of the feminine and the male and the female. So the male is of course the sun and the female is the moon. And when they are together in the sky, that's a particular high tide, which is what he means by Hochzeit, and therefore also the beginning of Ehe. So I think he sees it as I don't think he felt that you have to marry or something like that, but there are certain possibilities that open up along that road. Yeah.
But even if he meant that, I don't think that women of the time would really be sad or upset with it, because most, I mean, men who were not actually, I mean, who were conservative, wouldn't they just, skip the Hochzeit and just go with the, not with the marriage, with the sexual encounter, but without the marriage, without the responsibility towards the women who they would be with. I think he's actually being more responsible at his own time.
Yeah.
I mean, if he bring all the cultural. I mean, now women just want to, do everything and not get married, and they're actually thinking more like men. But at the time, I think he's thinking more like women in his own time, rather than like conservative men.
Yeah.
You have lots of stories again in religion, in Bible as well, when even prophets, they sleep with different women and they want to kind of get away with marrying them, but they are then brought back through different deceptions that women kind of
set up to
bring them back.
Yeah.
To say, hey, you can't just do that. And I think he's now kind of, I don't know, I haven't actually read this chapter, so it doesn't say much.
Yeah, that might be,
Maybe also I just wonder if it relates to like the idea of utopian, a kind of hope which requires work and like commitment and hardness, as opposed to a sort of flighty hope, is in a way akin to the hardness of a sort of marriage or like long sexual partnership instead of kind of fleeting sparks.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I think a lot of people also want a long-term sexual relationship, even today.
Yeah, but it's like if you compare the two types of hope, like I don't know, the dreamer who's sort of off on a new thing, and that versus the hope which actually requires a sort of
education.
Yeah, and a realism and a connection to others and the work to do that and the time. That's sort of akin to the two different types of sexual relationship, maybe.
Yeah.
That's right. There is a long chapter in Principle of Hope on Don Juan as a figure, and there is that point is made. But there also seems to be an indication that even on the road of Don Juan, there is a utopian. There's something utopian there.
Fantastical.
Yeah, maybe.
It's not real.
What do you mean it's not real?
It's like she was saying, it's a perception, whether you think it's going to be airy-fairy, or it's going to be something you need to struggle for.
Yeah.
The pursuit of happiness.
Yes, but Don Juan is also struggling. He is also fighting for something. He is looking for something. He is looking for the Augenblick, verweilen, occupies zu schön. Just as the married couple is doing that.
That's right.
So maybe there are different roads, but where he seems to suggest that the marriage is but I think, on the whole, it is mystical. It is, it's a theological. So being in love is a theological state, not a biological state. So I think he's talking about maybe even a kind of a notion of marriage that even if it can speak of Alterstil, is in a way removed from time. Yeah.
If we remember, this edition is dedicated to, wasn't he just bereaved?
Yeah.
It would be interesting to look at the differences between the two chapters and the editions with that event in mind. That was a marriage, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And
he was married.
Cut short by fate, so any theological...
Well, he married her when she was already terminally ill.
That does, to me, that does put things in a slightly different perspective.
Yeah.
And she was his wife who died was Christine Mystic.
Yeah.
Well, that puts it in a more different perspective.
Yeah. But it is interesting to ask how this relates to. I think if you think of position in feminism, feminist philosophy that have got to do with this, and they're not just purely entirely conservative, you would have to think of somebody like Elan Sissou, where you also get this idea that there is that she's often being accused of essentialism because she says there is something that is the feminine and something that is the masculine, and it even works its way into language. But I think if you read her correctly, she's not an essentialist in the sense she affirms some sort of platonic assets that the female and male is, but they're more processual and operative. But I think that's something that you might, if you wanted to rescue something of what's written here, then you might have to look in that direction.
And also just this sort of idea of longevity or something, like taking away the male and female in worldly terms, even if we keep it in mystical terms. I feel like today, for us now, that's very radical.
Yeah.
Rather than be conservative, it's the much harder path to build deeper in a way than
pick a mix.
Yeah, yeah. Especially, but I do feel like now that's a kind of crazy thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And,
yeah. No, that's like I said. I think most people really want to have a long-term relationship with somebody. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. And so it doesn't seem strange that somebody would say that.
And the seeking of union or connection or we, it doesn't surprise me that he starts with romantic love in his four things, because that is where we start anyway.
Yeah. And that's perhaps a middle course between sort of the mystical and the all too mundane. That is that this is again a figure of Selbstbegegnung.
Yeah.
So it's a figure of self-encounter in the form of erotic love, which is from Plato onwards has been a key experience, of course. Yeah. Okay. Well, this would be a whole topic in its own right, so we'll leave it at that. Next time, which will be the last session, we will read the last chapter, Karl Marx's Apocalypse and Death.
In no particular order.
No, exactly, it's Karl Marx's Death and Apocalypse. So thanks very much for this question. See you in 2 weeks.